The shadows of the mansion grew teeth at night. As Zuri recovered in her room, the door was kicked open by a figure masked in the darkness of the corridor. A heavy hand pinned her against the wall, the cold edge of a blade pressing into the soft skin beneath her jaw. "Go back where you came from," a distorted voice hissed, "before this house becomes your grave." The struggle was brief but violent. A lamp shattered, glass spraying across the floor like diamonds in the dark, before the assailant vanished into the labyrinth of the estate. Zuri collapsed to her knees, gasping, only to see a small, trembling figure standing in the doorway. Ji-Hoon's eyes were wide, reflecting the jagged shards of the broken lamp. He didn't cry. He simply walked over and buried his face in Zuri's shoulder, his small body shaking with a primal terror. "Don't leave," he whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. "Don't leave like Yama." The mention of his mother brought Min-jae into the room like a storm. He gathered the boy in his arms, his face a mask of restrained agony. Later, after the boy had finally drifted into a fitful sleep, Min-jae and Zuri sat in the dim light of the study. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and the lingering chill of the attack. "His mother died a year ago," Min-jae said, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on the floor. "A car accident. A brake failure on a rainy night. I told myself it was fate." Zuri looked at the tattooed hands that held so much power, now resting uselessly on his knees. "In this house? With the things I've seen?" she asked softly. "Min-jae, what if it wasn't an accident? What if the same person who is feeding your son poison was the one who cut those lines?" The silence that followed was brittle. Min-jae's walls, built of iron and blood, finally showed a hairline fracture. He leaned back, his eyes closing. "She begged me to leave this life," he whispered. "She said this world would kill our son. I didn't listen. I thought I could protect them with walls. I was arrogant." Zuri reached out, her hand hovering near his before pulling back. "I understand that weight," she confessed, her voice thick with a secret she had buried deep. "I spent my life in a kitchen trying to build a future for my daughter. I worked 3 jobs, I was never home, and when the sickness took her, I wasn't there to hold her hand. I couldn't save my own child, Min-jae. I lost everything I was working for." She looked at him, and for the first time, the Mafia king and the expatriate cook weren't strangers. They were simply 2 parents standing amidst the wreckage of their choices, bound by an unbearable guilt. "Maybe I can't fix the past," Zuri said, "but I can save your son. And maybe, in doing that, we both get to breathe again." The days that followed were a calculated masquerade of normalcy. Ji-Hoon continued to stabilize, his strength returning with every bowl of zesty greens and savory legumes Zuri prepared. Yet, the air in the mansion remained electric with a silent, growing dread. A quiet medical breakthrough had confirmed Zuri's darkest fears. Specialized blood tests, processed in a laboratory outside of Min-jae's usual network, detected trace amounts of arsenic. It was a slow-acting, heavy metal poisoning that had been administered in microscopic doses for over a year. The realization was a jagged blade to the heart of the household. It explained why every traditional Korean dish, sourced from the estate's long-standing, trusted suppliers, had only accelerated the boy's decline. Zuri's soul food hadn't just been an emotional comfort, it had been a biological sanctuary. By using her own imported spices, different grains, and obscure suppliers, she had unintentionally bypassed the poison supply chain, giving Ji-Hoon's body the first clean fuel it had seen in months. Min-jae's fury was cold and surgical. The hunt was no longer for a ghost, it was for a ghost who had walked these halls for at least 12 months. The suspicion was a corrosive acid, eating away at the foundation of his inner circle. In a move that signaled the depth of his desperation, he pitted his 2 shadows against one another. He pulled Marco and Raphael aside, ordering each to investigate the other's movements, bank accounts, and secret contacts. The 2 men, brothers in arms for a decade, now walked the corridors in a tense, silent standoff, eyes narrowed and hands perpetually hovering near their jackets. The atmosphere was ripe for a final, desperate move from the betrayer. Under the cover of dinner preparations, Zuri spoke loudly enough for the kitchen walls to hear. She sighed, wiping her brow with her stained apron, and announced that she had run out of a vital, rare spice. I have to go to the international market at dawn, she said, her voice carrying an intentional weariness. I'll be gone for most of the morning. Marco, please ensure the boy has only bottled water until I return. As the first light of morning touched the slate roofs of Seoul, a black car pulled away from the iron gates, ostensibly carrying Zuri away. But the figure in the passenger seat was merely a decoy wrapped in a red blouse. Back inside the darkened fortress, Zuri remained. She was crouched in a hidden service crawl space behind the pantry, her eyes fixed on the small gap in the paneling. Her breath was shallow, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Beside her in the shadows stood Min-jae, his presence a silent, terrifying weight. They waited in the suffocating silence, watching the kitchen, waiting for the one hand that would reach for Ji-Hoon's morning meal with a vial of death. The silence of the kitchen was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the refrigerators. From her cramped vantage point behind the service panel, Zuri's legs cramped, but she didn't move. Beside her, Min-jae was a statue carved from shadow, his breathing so shallow it was non-existent. Then, the soft click of the service door echoed through the room. A figure moved with practiced ease toward the counter where Ji-Hoon's morning bowl sat waiting. It was the uncle, Min-jae's most trusted advisor, a man who had held Ji-Hoon at his christening. He reached into the pocket of his tailored suit, pulling out a small glass vial. As he uncapped it, his hand didn't even tremble. He tilted the liquid toward the porridge, but before a single drop could fall, Zuri kicked the panel open. The wood splintered with a deafening crack. Zuri lunged forward, grabbing the man's wrist, the vial shattering against the granite. I knew it was you, she gasped, her eyes blazing with a mother's protective fury. Min-jae stepped from the darkness, his presence filling the room like a suffocating shroud. The uncle recoiled, his face contorting from a mask of wisdom into a sneer of desperate greed. You were always too sentimental, Min-jae, the man spat, realizing the trap had closed. The boy is a weak link. With him gone, the succession was mine. The rival gangs in the south promised a seat at the high table once your line was ended. Your wife, she saw it coming. She was going to tell you. I had to silence her car before she reached the gates. A low, primal growl erupted from Min-jae's chest. The air in the room seemed to freeze. He crossed the distance in a blur, his tattooed hand closing around the uncle's throat with a strength that turned the man's face a sickly purple. Min-jae's other hand reached for the suppressed pistol at his waist, his eyes devoid of anything but the desire for total annihilation. Min-jae, stop! Zuri cried, throwing herself between the Mafia king and his prey. She felt the heat radiating off him, the sheer pressure of his murderous rage. Look at the door. Ji-Hoon stood there, clutching the frame, his eyes wide with a terror that threatened to undo every ounce of healing they had achieved. Don't do this, Zuri whispered, her hand trembling as she placed it over Min-jae's gun. If you kill him here, you poison Ji-Hoon's soul just as surely as that man poisoned his body. Break the cycle. Don't let the last thing his mother tried to save be lost to blood. The silence stretched, thin as a wire about to snap. Min-jae looked at the terrified face of his son, then at the woman who had crossed an ocean to save them. Slowly, his fingers uncurled. He didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he signaled to Marco and Raphael, who moved in to bind the traitor. Call the authorities, Min-jae commanded, his voice a ragged whisper. For the first time in the history of the Kang Empire, the law was invited inside. He turned away from the violence of his past, reaching out to pull Ji-Hoon into his arms, finally understanding that true power wasn't in the taking of a life, but in the courage to protect one. The siren lights faded into the soul mist, taking the ghost of the betrayer with them. For the first time in a year, the air in the fortress didn't feel like a heavy shroud. Ji-Hoon was no longer a patient. He was a child again, sitting at the kitchen island and swinging his legs as Zuri prepared a celebratory plate of cornbread and honey. The threat was gone, but the silence between Min-jae and Zuri remained, thick with the weight of what came next. Min-jae stood by the stove, his suit jacket discarded and his white sleeves rolled up, revealing the intricate ink that mapped his old life. He looked at Zuri, not as a desperate employer, but as a man who had finally seen the sun. The debts on your mother's bistro have been settled, he said softly. But I don't want you to go back to that empty kitchen. Stay. Not as a cook, and not because of a contract. Stay as family. Zuri's heart hammered against her ribs, a mix of longing and a sharp, sudden grief. She looked at Ji-Hoon, then back at Min-jae, shaking her head slowly. I can't, Min-jae. This home, it belongs to her. Every time Ji-Hoon looks at me, I'm afraid I'm just a shadow filling a space I didn't earn. I can't replace his mother. Min-jae didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered photograph, laying it gently on the granite counter between them. Zuri leaned in, her breath hitching. The photo showed a beautiful Korean woman in a simple denim apron, laughing amidst a group of volunteers in a humble, sun-drenched kitchen. My wife was a humanitarian, Min-jae explained, his voice thick with a bittersweet pride. Before we married, she spent a year in the American South, working in community programs. She told me it was the only place she ever felt a peace that didn't require a title. Zuri's fingers trembled as she touched the edge of the photo. She recognized the distinctive stained glass window in the background and the peculiar height of the industrial ovens. This is Grace Fellowship, she whispered, her voice breaking. In Atlanta. I volunteered in that exact kitchen every Saturday after I lost my daughter. It was the only place I felt close to her. The impossible reality settled over the room like a benediction. Min-jae pulled a silk-bound notebook from a drawer, his wife's private journal. The pages were filled with frantic, beautiful notes in Korean and English, sketches of fusion dishes, and attempts to blend the heat of gochujang with the soul of a southern roux. She died before she could cook these for him, Min-jae said, looking at his son. She wanted Ji-Hoon to know both cultures, both kinds of love. She wanted him to have the strength of my world and the soul of yours. He looked at Zuri, his gray eyes shining with a profound realization. She didn't leave him alone, Zuri. Across an ocean and through the years, she was leading you here to finish the meal she started. The revelation hung in the air, warmer than the steam rising from the stove. Zuri looked from the faded photograph to the silk-bound notebook, her eyes blurring with a sudden, overwhelming clarity. She didn't just leave a legacy, Zuri whispered, her voice thick with wonder. She sent me across an ocean to finish what she started. The grief that had haunted her for years, the feeling of being a drifter without a port, finally began to dissolve. She wasn't an intruder in this house. She was the answer to a prayer whispered in an Atlanta church kitchen years before. Min-jae placed his wife's notebook into Zuri's hands, the leather soft and worn. Inside, the frantic scribbles of a woman trying to bridge two worlds became a roadmap for their future. Ji-Hoon reached out, his small hand covering the pages, his eyes bright with a light that had nothing to do with medicine. Teach me, he said, the words clear and certain. Teach me to cook both ways, like Yama wanted. In that moment, the shadow of the replacement vanished. Zuri realized she wasn't there to stand in a dead woman's place, but to stand beside her vision, honoring a mother who had loved her son enough to provide for him even after she was gone. 5 years later, the iron gates of the Kang estate stood open, no longer a barrier but an invitation. Ji-Hoon was no longer the frail boy in the silk sheets. He was a thriving teenager, tall and broad-shouldered, moving through the kitchen with a confident grace. He spent his afternoons at Two Mothers Kitchen, the restaurant Zuri and Min-jae had built in the heart of Seoul. The sign outside featured two calligraphic styles, the elegant strokes of Korean and the bold, warm letters of Seoul food intertwined like ivy. The menu was a living testament to the two women who had saved the Kang line. Spicy gochujang glazed fried chicken served with honey butter cornbread, and savory collard greens seasoned with smoked brisket and kimchi. Min-jae had stepped back from the violence of the underworld, legitimizing his holdings into a global logistics empire that focused on food security and community outreach. Marco and Raphael remained, though their suits were now less formal, their eyes watchful not for assassins, but for the safety of the family they had helped forge. Zuri had never become mother to Ji-Hoon, and she never tried to. Instead, she became his auntie, his guardian angel, the woman who had walked through fire to bring his mother's recipes to life. In the final quiet of the evening, as the restaurant lights dimmed, Zuri stood at the large central prep table with Ji-Hoon. On the wall behind them, two photos hung side by side in a single frame, one of a woman in an Atlanta church and one of a grandmother in a Maine kitchen. Together, they looked over a new generation. "Watch the heat on the roux, Ji-Hoon," Zuri said, guiding his hand as he stirred a pot of fusion gumbo. "Your mother knew the secret before I even arrived. She knew that food connects souls across any distance, and love is the only bridge that never breaks." As the savory scent filled the room, the legacy was complete. A story written in spices, proof that even when a mother leaves, her love always finds a way to feed her child.